Right, welcome to episode 2 of the new series I'm doing, Why Did I Crash? Here we're basically going through data dives from on-track incidents from people I've met and people that have been kind enough to loan me their data. Again, I'm extremely grateful that they've made this available and kind of open it up to the world so that we all can really benefit from what happened and try to learn from it. And try to prevent these mistakes ourselves. I mean, I think there's a reality that if you're doing track days, doing racing, there's a good chance eventually something's going to happen and you're going to have an off. And so today we're going to look at an incident that happened at VIR, specifically at turn 10 at VIR. And let's start by going ahead and just taking a look at the video at full speed.
Detected. Connecting to OnStar.
All right, now that we've seen the video, you see this happen at turn 10. Turn 10 at VIR is a fast left-hander, kind of crests the hill about mid-corner to corner exit. And so it's tricky because it's a blind exit. And then of course you've got the traction changes as you actually crest the hill itself as the car gets slightly unweighted. So again, looking at the data, I'm actually going to go and use two different charts today just to try to make this a little easier for you to follow so we don't have so many squiggly lines all in one chart. And what I've done here is the red line is the lap where the incident actually happened. The blue line is the same driver's fast lap from that session. And the green is just the previous lap from that same session to the incident. So I kind of want to give you a little bit of a sense of what the driver was doing overall to be able to take a look at these things and just compare what's different. So on the data trace here, on this kind of first trace, we have basically the basics. We've got the accelerator. Again, I've actually ordered them on the chart in order with these labels over here. So again, hopefully it's easier to follow that way. So this is your accelerator trace. This is your brake trace. This is your speed trace. This is your steering angle. This is the vertical acceleration. So we've not used that before. Just like that has lateral and longitudinal acceleration, the C7's also got a vertical acceleration. So 1G is basically, the car is sitting on the ground with the force of gravity acting on it. And then the bottom one here is the yaw rate. And then we're going to look here in a second at a second chart that's got additional data on it. But let's see, what do we see from looking at the chart? Well, you can see right here where basically the driver starts correcting the steering angle, and you can see that effectively this is kind of where it's clearly lost control. You can also see down here at the bottom in the yaw rate, right about here is where the yaw rate starts to change dramatically. So this is probably where the car actually stepped out. This is how long it took the driver to actually correct with steering. But if you back up to really the beginning of this sequence, right about here. So here is where the driver goes back to the throttle. So as you're coming up through the S's, you kind of reach the top, you slow down, and then you usually want to have at least some maintenance throttle going through turn 10 to keep the back end of the car weighted, but typically don't put a lot of throttle in. So it's worth noting here that in the green lap, the driver waits a good bit longer. In fact, what's that, 46 feet I'm looking at over here to 7670. Oops, I have a hard time getting like a detailed thing here because it's so zoomed in. But basically, it was a good 50 feet the driver waited to get back to the throttle in the previous lap. On their fast lap, they were on the throttle earlier again, but at a much lower rate. So you can see, comparatively, the driver goes very quickly right up to 75% throttle, and whereas in the fast lap, it was only 24% throttle. So right off the bat, my initial diagnosis to the driver was you basically went back to the gas too aggressively, and that's what caused the car to basically the back end to step out. And that's partially true, but again, the more I looked at this data and prepping for this video, the more I realized that really wasn't the whole story, because you don't see the car start to yaw until here. So what else is going on? So first of all, again, going back to the point where we first go back to throttle, if you look at your vertical G's here, you see we've got this trough. So the driver went back to throttle just as the car was at its most unweighted point. So as you can see over here, the vertical acceleration is 0.93 Gs. So, the car is roughly 300 pounds lighter effectively than it would normally be. So you've got less grip from that to begin with. And you can see they're carrying this throttle, all through the corner. And see the net effect of this on the speed trace, like right in the middle here where the speed trace starts at about the same, at about 83, 81 miles an hour. That extra throttle, which normally be a good thing for gaining time, has really created basically built a lot more speed. So right here, you're already up to almost 90 miles an hour, so a good 78 miles an hour faster than the prior laps. And also what starts to happen here is the car's plateaued, but then the car also starts to drop off again. So as the car's dropping off again on the vertical G's, the driver goes and commits to full throttle. And so the question is, whereas he's gone to heavy throttles like this before, is there something that happened back here that helped precipitate an event? Clearly going to full throttle when you're losing some of the weight on the car a little bit here clearly contributed to it. You also have a lot more speed. Okay, so you can see again right in here we're still at that 8 miles an hour faster. And then I also want you to note right in here is the steering trace. So what happened? You see the steering's fairly consistent through here, but the driver holds the wheel longer. So at the time they go back to full throttle, at the time the car is unweighting, the steering input, as opposed to being your 25, 20, or 24, 26 degrees, they've got 36, 37 degrees of steering input. So more steering input, more throttle, higher speeds, car unweighting, starting to look like that's a big contributor. But I want to look at some other data as well to kind of feed into this. I mentioned the yaw rate down here. It's worth noting that this particular car, I believe it was a 2016 C7 Z06. It didn't have the yaw sensor data built into the PDR. The car had a sensor, but the PDR doesn't collect it until you have a 2018 or late 2017 car. So the yaw rate here is actually calculated. So what I've done is taken that heading channel we talked about. I've basically created a math channel that takes a derivative of the heading, and that effectively is the yaw calculated from the GPS data. So again, you can see the yaw starting here, as the driver goes back to full throttle. Let's look at a couple other things. Let's go back to when this first started again. So we're all the way back here, and I'm going to click on this chart that I've labeled power. So I just want to highlight something kind of interesting. So this is Accelerator Trace, and then the second trace is something called engine torque request. So this is output by the ECU, and this is basically the amount of torque that it's trying to produce from the motor. So you can see the driver very quickly ramped up the accelerator, and then it took a bit, I think probably for the boost to build, but shortly thereafter, the engine's making almost 650 foot-pounds of torque, whereas on prior laps, it was only 180 or 140. So you've got a good, 500 extra pound-feet of torque going into that corner, being put to the rear wheels than you had in prior laps. So is there wheel spin going on? That was really the question I was trying to answer. So let's go look at a different chart with some different data on it. So again, up top here, we have the accelerator, just like before. We have something that I'm calling the Speedo Error. So what this is I'm calculating speed off the GPS data with a math channel, and I'm also taking the speed that the car is showing. Typically with the Corvettes, or with the C7s, the speed is derived from the wheel speed sensors. I'm not sure exactly which wheel speed sensors it is. I know it's not just one that it maps directly to, but I do know that if you spin the rear tires, you will get the speedo to go up. So what we're seeing here is the difference between the GPS speed and the indicated speed on the speedometer. And so it's interesting to see up here where the basically you have a positive delta is probably where we're braking. We're getting a little bit of the rear wheel slowing down relative to the fronts. But then right around this point where you go back to gas, what you start seeing is this speed delta gap starts building. So you don't see this elsewhere in the trace where you have, you go from very small, quarter of a mile per hour differences to on our lap where we had the issue where we're using a lot of throttle, we have a 3 mile an hour speed difference. And that builds all the way up here to where you've got a 5 mile an hour speed difference. So I suspect what was happening through here is you're actually, that aggressive going back to throttle was causing a little bit of wheel spin, probably just the smallest amount, but it was enough to basically lessen the amount of grip in the rear of the car. So wanted to show you that. And then again, let's overlay all that with, again, the vertical acceleration data. So here we see that tail off just as the car is going to full throttle. You see again the increase here in the rear wheel speed difference, or the wheel speed difference, and then you start to see the user making the driving correction. So I think what you have here is a combination of effects, much like the last video, where too aggressive going back to the initial throttle, but also the time where they, or the way they continue to add steering input instead of opening the wheel. So hopefully this helps. Again, this is one of those things that happens. It's very minute changes in the way you add your inputs, and I think the moral of the story is not to go back to the gas quite so aggressively so early. And I hope everybody finds this helpful. Again, thanks for the positive feedback, and I'll keep doing these and ask any questions in the comments. Thanks.